Hello and welcome to Black, Brown, and Bilingue, where our mission is to unite the Black and Brown communities through education, storytelling, and community engagement.
And welcome to Black, Brown, and Bilingue. I am one of your hosts, Lissette Jacobson.
And I'm your other host, Maurice McDavid.
The vision of Black, Brown, and Bilingue is to be part of creating a world in which Black and Brown identities are affirmed, bilingualism and biculturalism are nurtured, and equity is the driving force behind all that we do.
You know, when we took some time and thought about why a podcast and why us, we came really down to these two answers. And, I think number one is that we both are millennials and in positions of leadership in our school district. Both of us operate as building principals and wanting to bring those voices forward.
Yes, for us, it is very important to have a platform to share some of our perspectives revolving around education, race, culture. And I know that in particular for me, there are not a lot of groups out there or podcasts for Latinas in leadership roles, particularly in education. And so it was very important that we brought that forward.
Absolutely. Looking to bring those marginalized voices to center stage. And so you're here at Black, Brown, and Bilingue. And again, we thank you for joining us.
Yes, our title for today is A Brotha and a Latina Walk into a School. So what you can expect is really the journey of our careers, where we are today, and really going back in time to how we ended up as building principals in the same district.
Absolutely. So, Lissette, you've mentioned it already, that we currently work together, but this is not actually where our careers started together. And so you and I both began our teaching career in the DeKalb School District. And from there, we've done our master's program together. We have gone into leadership at similar times, and now we're actually back working in the same district. But I want to take it back. Okay, I want to take it back for a moment here, and I want you to think back to that new teacher orientation. You walked in. Just help me, visualize what were some of the thoughts that you were having on that day.
It was very ecstatic to be working alongside my cooperating teacher. I actually secured a first grade bilingual position where my cooperating teacher would be my colleague. And I was nervous. I was excited. And you know what? I'll be honest. I had no intention of staying in DeKalb. It's a community that's vastly different from the one that I grew up in. But at that time, there was really no talk of that teacher shortage. So it was very competitive. Everything, at NIU, our interviewing seminars, it was like you have to really bring your A game because there are so many applicants with such few positions to fill. And so I remember being just excited and blessed that I got a job. So I walk in, and when you walk in and you're a minority, you do that quick scan around the room and quickly realize that I was the only Latina in the room. And then there was you, Maurice, on probably like the left-hand side at the top row, and you were just yakking away. And I was like, okay, this guy is loud.
Yeah, well, again, I got to put on for the culture. So one of the reasons I was able to be so loud is because my experience had been slightly different. While I had attended undergrad down in Galesburg, Illinois at Knox College and student taught down there, I had come back in the fall of 2010 after student teaching and worked as an instructional assistant in the DeKalb School District. So then after that, in that spring of 2011, I was hired on to teach middle school in the district. And so walking into that new teacher orientation, I did not necessarily feel as isolated or as new because I knew people there. And actually, I was a what we call here a townie, right? I had been in schools. I was born and raised in DeKalb, had gone pre-K through 12 in DeKalb, so I knew a lot of the adults in the room as people who had poured into my educational experience. So it was a little bit easier to be louder and to be bolder. But what I will say is I thought, okay, well, I wonder who else they're hiring. And I began to scan the room and said, okay, is it just me? Am I the only person of color coming in? And I do remember seeing you, Lissette, and I'm going to share a little something right here on this podcast that I have not shared prior to this. When I saw Lissette and I heard Jacobson, which was her married name, I was not sure if she was Latina or not. I knew that she was bilingual, and so that was going to connect us because I speak Spanish as well, but I was not sure if she was Latina. Obviously, we've discovered that later on, and I have felt that, as you like to say, that Latin heat, you know what I'm saying, and that you and I have had. And
bring the sass.
Yeah. That's all right.
That's funny. That's funny you mentioned that because I get that a lot, and it wasn't until my professional career and just being an adult that I realized how much privilege I have from being a light-skinned Latina, and that is something that is very pervasive in the Latin community, and it's really a shame, and I feel like that could be another episode, right? But I've gotten that a lot. In fact, when how the teacher tags are outside of the classroom, parents would come in and they'd look in the room and I'd be sitting there and they thought I was the assistant, or they didn't think that I was Mrs. Jacobson. So it's been very interesting to be a Latina in education with that last name.
Absolutely. So Lissette, you mentioned first grade bilingual.
Yeah.
Take me from new teacher orientation to that moment where now all of a sudden you have 20 plus little 6-year-olds who are bilingual and looking to engage with you in Inglés y Español, los dos.
Ay, mis lindos.
Tell me about that first day of school.
Oh, I was so ecstatic. And when you're young and you're a new first-year teacher, you're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and I don't think you really understand the full scope of responsibility until that very first day. And so I vividly remember my students were lining up and we were getting ready to go into the building. And as we were walking in, my building principal just gave me this look like, "Ooh, good luck." She patted me on the back, and it was surreal, but it was very nerve-wracking at the same time. But this was also too the realization of a dream, because I've always wanted to be a teacher. So it was a beautiful moment that you never forget, but you almost have to be a little naive, to be honest, because it's such a huge responsibility and you really don't realize the scope of it.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that dream piece, but we'll get back to that because I just want to share, I had a similar experience. That first day, we had all of the 8th graders sitting in the main gym at Clinton Rosette was the name of the building, and one by one, we called out the kids in our homeroom. And as I stepped forward, it was my turn to call out the students. I'm shaking. My voice is shaking. And I'm calling these kids out by name. And all of a sudden, I have 32 kids lined up behind me. And we make our way upstairs to my classroom. And my thought process that entire time is, it is now my job to keep these kids entertained and safe for the next hour and 15 minutes because we had a special rotation that day. But it was my job to talk to them about how to be 8th graders when it was my first day being an 8th grade teacher. 10 years prior to that, I had been an 8th grader, wow. And so it really was just mind-boggling. And I had several of those experiences, I think, throughout education. I ran our district, Washington, DC trip, which was taking a group of eighth graders. And the first trip I took, I was 25 years old, and I remember thinking, these parents trust me, a 25-year-old, to take their eighth graders all the way to Washington, D.C. But again, that takes me back to that first day and just feeling like, but what happened was I stood there and I began to talk to the students, and all of a sudden something clicked, and it just happened, and I was home in that moment of teaching, and I still feel that way in working with education.
So let me ask you this, like, you had the added challenge of, you're working with eighth grade students, and you being fresh out of college, you really had to distinguish yourself, right? Like, I am the teacher, because you're so close in age, even though it may not seem like it, you really are. Whereas for me, I think it was a little bit easier to demand the classroom, right? The respect, because they're little first graders. But did you feel that challenge of being a young Black man in the classroom in front of these eighth graders? Was that like an added pressure for you?
So I'll say a couple of things. I think number one, it helps to be a 6'1" Black man. When it comes to demanding respect, that does help, because I was a football coach. I was coaching football at that point at the high school level, and had played football, had actually coached at the college level while I was student teaching. So I was used to working, and in that case, these were students who I had played with the year before, and now I was coaching them. So I think that was beneficial. But you talk about that age gap piece being really small. I want to share this quick story. I was, telling the kids something about when I was a kid, or when I got my first cell phone, and one of them was, "Oh, Mr. McDavid, you're so old. Mr. McDavid, you're so old." And I said, "Guys, I'm only 10 years older than you. When I'm 40, you'll be 30, and we'll all be adults." And so this young lady raises her hand, and she says, "So, Mr. McDavid, does that mean if things don't work out between you and your wife, we can date?"
No way!
And I said, "You know what? Let me go back to being old. You're right. Let me go back to being old."
Yeah.
But what I will say is I think my teaching style was such that relationships were going to be key. I could clown with the kids. I was willing to play the dozens with the kids. I was willing, I freestyle battled the kids on Friday if we had a homework percentage that was high enough. So I think I was able to maintain that position of authority while also engaging in a lot of memory making.
Yeah, no, mine came through that motherly, Hispanic woman or Latina woman, and I just treated them as my own kids, and it worked. And so I think that definitely was easier for me. I do remember that when I went into the middle school, because I eventually became an eighth grade teacher myself, and one of the things that struck me the most was how different my interactions were with those students. And I was very aware of that age gap. And so I did everything in my power, down to how I dressed, right? Made sure that I had almost a blazer and nice slacks every day, because I wanted to have that distinction. So can you tell me, though, why education for you, or can you tell me a little bit about your educational journey?
Yeah, so, I'll start thinking even about my experience as a child in a classroom. One of the things that I always share with people when I'm talking about my desire to become an educator is the fact that I did not have my first African-American male teacher until I was 21.
Wow.
I was a junior in college, and I was sitting in an American history class with Professor Conrad Hamilton, and I loved American history. That's what I taught at the eighth grade level for the first few years of my career. And I was enraptured by this class, and I thought, I love history, but is that it? And it finally hit me that for the first time in my life, I saw somebody that looked like me at the front of the classroom. And he dressed sharp, always had on a tie or a bow tie, sometimes a sweater, half Black, half Japanese. He told the story about how about how his father and mother had to go to another state in order to get married.
Wow.
Because there were still anti-miscegenation laws. And again, that personal connection to history that my parents could have shared, I think made really an impact. So I think back, about my experience in education, and I had tremendous teachers. I had people that I really cared about and that I know cared about me. In fact, some of those folk that I still talk to, even to this day, that I've taught alongside, and I think that really my ending up in that career, even unbeknownst to me, was definitely directly related to a lot of those great educators that I had. And again, I mean, that was before we were talking even anti-racist education. It was just people who I knew, cared. I think that makes a huge difference, definitely.
So, for me, bilingualism has played such a role in my life. And, the name of the podcast is Black, Brown, and Bilingual, right? You're Black, I'm brown, and we're both bilingual. But when I think of my experiences as a child in the classroom, I really felt like my bilingualism was stripped away from me. So back then, bilingual programming was nowhere near what it is today. And it was, get you in, get you to learn English as quickly as possible, and then you're immersed in all English. I actually was enrolled in a bilingual kindergarten class, but I was speaking to like the other kids in the classroom in English. And so, to be honest, I don't even really remember. I just know that my teacher may have recommended that I get tested for the English only kindergarten. And they pulled me into a room. They asked me some questions, and I must have answered them well enough, because then my classroom was switched. And so then I was in an all English class. And I hear, and in fact, you've seen that tweet or those posts on social media where it's like, how old were you when you had your first Black teacher? And even though I'm Latina, my first teacher my kindergarten teacher was Black. And she played such a huge role in me wanting to be a teacher. And it's interesting because even though she wasn't Latina, I knew she was different than a white teacher. She was not Latina, but she was different. And she's really the reason why I love to read. And she taught me how to read, and she really instilled a love of books. I remember flipping couch cushions, looking for change so that I could go to the Scholastic book orders and look for the dollar. When you go down the list and you're scrolling and, oh, that's $1, I can get that one. And so she really instilled that love. And so I feel very blessed. And I really think that because I had her as my kindergarten teacher, I felt like I could do it too, even though she wasn't Latina. And then fast forward, so that was in Chicago. Then we moved to Waukegan. And then in 6th grade, we had a long-term sub, Miss Coleman, for 6th grade social studies. And she was African-American. And then 7th grade, Mr. Johnson. I adore that man. Also African-American. So I actually have had pretty diverse teachers. And you know what? I know that's not the norm, but to me, that was my norm. It wasn't until I became a teacher that I realized, wow, not everyone has been that lucky, because it really has been a blessing.
Yeah. So recognizing that, statistically speaking, right, our national teacher population is about 2% African-American men. We know that it is not the norm, and yet my children will have been very fortunate that they have had up to this point nothing but African-American teachers. My son is in 3rd grade, and he has had nothing but African-American teachers, and so there is a shift that is happening there. There is something that's going on. At the high school, there was one African-American teacher, and he was the band director. And unfortunately, I can't carry a tune, even in a brown paper bag. And so, although I have used this quarantine time to tickle the ivories a little bit, so I'm learning.
You know what? I will say I saw you dancing to that traditional Mexican music when you went in to meet your stat for this upcoming year. And you've always said you have 2 left feet, but you did all right.
Por la gracia de Dios. It was only God's grace. It was only God's grace. So, he didn't want me to be embarrassed in front of my new staff right there in that moment. So I think when it comes to education and thinking back on our own experiences, I wonder for you, did representation or the lack thereof play a role in motivating you to become an educator?
So, like I had spoken to previously, my kindergarten teacher really was a huge reason why, and I do think representation played a big role. I come from a family of educators, though. I have family in Mexico who teach, so I feel like it's in me. But I think a big one, it's funny, I did not want to be a bilingual teacher. I actually was very much against it because I still came in from that deficit standpoint, right? Because that's what bilingual programming used to look like. And so I really didn't believe in bilingual education until I learned and I knew better. But I think there are a lot of Latinos. I mean, even now I see parents that are like, no, English only, it's fine. And so they're not realizing that.
Es una lástima, ¿no?
Sí. I was just about to say.
What a shame. It took me, 4 years in high school, another 4 years in college, studying abroad in Spain, and still I probably speak Spanish at about a 7th or 8th grade level, and that's being kind, but to have that opportunity to have it be a part, but I also understand, culturally where it can appear that.
Sí, es una lástima, and but here's I think a bigger piece. It's that the Spanish language is not a language of status, and we have to really elevate the status. And so for me, it was never elevated. I have vivid memories of walking into a parent-teacher conference, and I can't even believe I'm about to put this out in the universe, but feeling deep shame that I had to be that child to translate for my parents at a conference. It was like my worlds colliding. And that is probably the first time I realized that I was different. Was in 2nd grade, Mrs. Stewart's class, and my dad comes in for a parent-teacher conference, and I started to translate, and I just sunk in my chair.
Wow.
Because I adored my teachers. I mean, I've been blessed. I've loved all my teachers, but I adored my teacher. And so then here's my father, who I also adore. But I felt deep shame. The teacher really didn't say anything. She was very graceful, but it's very important for teachers to understand is that you may not necessarily say anything explicitly, but your students are still receiving messages. And so that really was the beginning of me wanting to keep my home life and my school life as far away from each other as possible. I was the kid that when notices were sent home, I wouldn't show it to my parents. I wouldn't even give them the papers because I did not want that. And I would beg my older sister, hey, can you come to the school and pretend to be my mom? Because I didn't want to have to translate. And so it's that was something that was very hard to grapple with, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized, man, I really have to grapple with this. I really need to unpack this because there's a lot there.
So it's interesting because, for you, that representation piece was not necessarily in what people looked like, but it was the representation of the language, right? It was because there was not representation of that home language, that there was that discord. I think for me, that representation was absolutely something visual. I can think a lot about the images of Black people that I grew up seeing. The images that I grew up seeing were on MTV or BET or ESPN. We were a little after the Cosby Show, right? So it's not like we were growing up watching a doctor and a lawyer.
I did watch the Cosby Show.
Well, see, okay, power to you.
Family Matters and
Family Matters. Did get a little Family Matters. But still, a lot of that representation for me was absolutely it was West Coast Connection. It was, To Live and Die in LA. And so when I think about those things, I think that impacted, even, I'll share with you, this was spring of 2005. I was at a church service in Harvey, and I was talking to a young lady there who was in high school. She was Black, and I told her I was going to go to school and become a lawyer or a doctor. And she said, "What? Those are white people jobs. You can't do that."
That's a big one.
That's 2005. Yeah. That was a mindset. So for me, education was something that kind of fell into me. I went to Knox with a pre-law mindset, got closed out of a political science class, and instead ended up taking the school and society class. And it was Ed 201. And during that class, we went and saw the movie Freedom Writers.
Freedom Writers.
Yes. And Hilary Swank's character says at one point in the movie, "I was going to become a lawyer, but by the time you're defending a kid in the courtroom, it's too late, and the real battle is in the classroom." And I literally went the next week and signed up to be an education major. And so my fight in the classroom has been and always will be one that is based in social justice. It's one that's based in the idea that knowledge is power, and I'll take that a step further. Applied knowledge is power. It is when we can.
I saw that tweet. Yes. Yes. So you know what, too, just to go off of what you're saying too, that's what drove me into education, is that desire to really affirm our students in their identities, and to make sure that they know that I see them, that I see their humanity, and that I value who they are. Because no one explicitly said it like that. And like you said, with the language, that was such a huge part of me that I ignored and kind of shelved for many, many years, until someone showed me what an asset it was. And so, like I said, and you think about our students. I don't know how many, I think by the year 2040, over half of our student population will be Latino, will be brown children. And what messages are they receiving in regards to language? And again, no one really said anything negative about Spanish, but somehow I still internalized that. So I became a teacher so that I could affirm students' identities. And really, without that strong sense of self, I just feel like that leads to your success. If you stand firm in who you are, you will make it far.
Absolutely. Well, Lissette, for the sake of our listeners, let's get ready to wrap this up. I am just ecstatic to be working on Black, Brown, and Bilingue with you, and I am excited that our listeners have joined us for this first episode of what I hope to be many more episodes to come. I know we've got some exciting topics that we have planned coming up. Lissette, you want to tell them about a couple of the topics that you're excited about?
I am looking forward to the Black-Brown divide. I think that with everything that is happening right now, I know that I've joked with you, Maurice, about keeping the Black and Brown divide alive, but that's one topic I'm particularly interested in and excited to talk about. Another one is this idea of being not only Black and Brown and bilingue, but also being millennial school leaders and some of those implications. What are some of yours?
So a couple of them that I am looking forward to most certainly is the conversation on what happens when you move up into that middle class, and what happens to identity and being able to maintain that identity. And then the other piece, of course, as we talk about bilingualism, we want to talk about bilingualism and quote unquote proper English. Yeah. I gotta just give you just a little taste. I saw a video the other day in which Candace Owens, and if you know her, you know her, okay? But Candace Owens says that the reason that 75% of our Black boys don't do well on reading tests is because we speak Ebonics. To which I would say, shenanigans. That's absolute nonsense. I speak Ebonics on a regular basis, and I read and have been reading at a college level for a long time. But again, we can talk about that more then. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too, because we can even bring in the Spanglish debate too, right? And this whole idea of proper English, that's exciting. But you know what? Before we close out the show, let's give people one thing that we want them to think about in terms, like, regardless of whether they are educators or not. What is one thing that you would like the listener to walk away with?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I would like the listeners to walk away with from today's show is just an understanding that whoever you are, whatever you look like, you are not a monolith, and yet you will carry the weight of representation. And so I want you to know that it is important that you just be your best you every day, because, people are looking, and particularly for our educators of color, I know that the burden is heavy some days, but we've got to always be on our best foot.
Yeah, and I think for me, for all of the educators listening out there, it would be to make sure that you are saying things that uplift your students directly, because going back to my point earlier, what my teacher didn't say spoke volumes. And so being cognizant of the fact that, it is our duty to affirm our students' identities. It is our duty. Or like Michael Fullen would say, it's our moral imperative.
Absolutely. Right. So, folks, thank you again for joining us today. If you are interested in finding out more information about Black, Brown, and Bilingue, you can follow our Facebook page at Black, Brown, Bilingue, or you can follow us on Twitter at BLKBRWN Bilingue. And we are on Twitter, and then you can find our website information there. So, again, thank you so much for joining us today. To sign off, I'm Maurice McDavid.
And I'm Lissette Jacobson.
Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.